So let's talk about elections. You know, that magical time when people get to choose their leaders, a cornerstone of democracy, the festival of the ballot box. But what happens when the festival gets weird? I'm talking about elections in Africa, where sometimes the democratic process feels less like a choice and more like a suggestion that the government politely ignores. We've all seen the headlines, right? Controversial election sparks protests, opposition leader arrested, results delayed due to reasons. It's a recurring theme that pops up on the news cycle, a story that feels both foreign and honestly frustratingly familiar. These aren't just minor hiccups or counting errors. We're talking about elections that made international news for all the wrong reasons. They are tales of drama, intrigue, and sometimes outright absurdity, where the final results seem to have been decided long before the first vote was even cast. It's like watching a magic show where you know the rabbit is already in the hat, but everyone has to sit through the performance anyway. These are the stories that challenge the very idea of a free and fair election, leaving citizens feeling cheated and the international community scratching its head. In this video, we're going to dive deep into 10 of the most infamous, most controversial, and frankly, most unbelievable elections across the African continent. We'll unpack the how, the why, and the wait. They did what? Moments that defined these votes. From mysterious power outages to voter turnouts that defy mathematics, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey into the heart of political power plays, where the will of the people hangs precariously in the balance. So, buckle up, because we're about to explore the top 10 rigged African elections that you truly won't believe. Our first stop is Zimbabwe, 2008. Picture this. Robert Mugabe, a man who had been in power since forever, was facing a serious challenge from Morgan Tsvangirai and the Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC. The people were hungry for change, literally and figuratively. The economy was in a freefall so spectacular the currency had more zeros than a lottery jackpot, but was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The atmosphere was electric with the possibility that, for the first time in decades, the old guard might actually be on its way out. The people went to the polls, filled with hope. And then, the results started to trickle in, or rather, they didn't. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, in a masterclass of suspense, or perhaps just panic, held on to the presidential results for over a month. A whole month! You could watch an entire season of a TV show, learn a new language, or maybe even count all the zeros on a Zimbabwean dollar note in that time. When they finally announced the numbers, they claimed Tsvangirai won, but not by enough to avoid a runoff. It was a cliffhanger nobody asked for, and it set the stage for a truly dark chapter in the country's history. This is where things went from a political contest to a brutal campaign of intimidation. The period leading up to the runoff was marked by horrific violence. Opposition supporters were targeted, beaten, and killed. The state machinery was unleashed not to protect citizens, but to terrorize them into submission. It was a campaign of fear, orchestrated to ensure that no one would dare vote against the ruling party. The message was clear and chilling. Your vote is your choice, but your life depends on making the right choice. It was less an election and more a hostage negotiation. The violence became so widespread and systematic that international observers, who were already thin on the ground, condemned it outright. Human rights organizations documented hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. Tsvangirai, fearing for the lives of his supporters and recognizing that a free and fair election was impossible under these conditions, made the painful decision to withdraw from the runoff. He said he couldn't ask people to vote for him when that very act could be a death sentence. It was a tragic admission that the democratic process had completely collapsed. So, Robert Mugabe stood in the runoff, unopposed. He won an election where he was the only candidate. It was a victory in the same way that I would win a race against myself, guaranteed but utterly meaningless. The international community called it a sham, a mockery of democracy. The 2008 election in Zimbabwe wasn't just rigged, it was stolen in broad daylight, using the weapons of fear and violence, leaving a deep and lasting scar on the nation's soul, and serving as a textbook example of how to cling to power at any human cost. Next, we travel to East Africa, to Kenya in 2007. This election was supposed to be a showcase of vibrant democracy. The incumbent, Mwai Kibaki, was up against the charismatic opposition leader, Raila Odinga. The campaigns were passionate, the debates were fierce, and the turnout was massive. For a moment it looked like a model election, a testament to the power of the people's voice in a region often plagued by political instability. Kenyans from all walks of life stood in line for hours, united by a belief in the democratic process and a hope for a better future. The voting itself went relatively smoothly. People cast their ballots, and the counting began. Early results, broadcast live on television, showed Raila Odinga with a comfortable lead. It seemed like the country was on the verge of a political shift. His supporters began celebrating in the streets, sensing a victory that felt almost inevitable. The mood was optimistic, and it felt like the nation was collectively holding its breath, waiting for the final official confirmation of what they were seeing on their screens. But in politics, especially during a tense election, things can change in the blink of an eye. Then, things got strange. The live broadcasts of the results were abruptly stopped. The Electoral Commission of Kenya, or ECK, started announcing results from different constituencies that showed a sudden, dramatic swing in favor of the incumbent, Mwai Kibaki. These results often came from Kibaki's strongholds and were announced after long, unexplained delays. Eyebrows were raised. Then they were raised higher when international observers and journalists started pointing out massive discrepancies. The numbers just didn't add up. It was like watching a football match where one team is winning 3-0, the screen goes blank, and when it comes back on, the other team has suddenly scored 5 goals. The chairman of the ECA, Samuel Kivuitu, became a symbol of the chaos. In a moment of bizarre and alarming honesty, just before announcing the final results, he admitted that he didn't even know who had actually won. He famously said, "I do not know whether Kibaki won the election." Despite this, he proceeded to declare Mwai Kibaki the winner by a razor-thin margin. Kibaki was then hastily sworn in at a rushed dusk ceremony at State House, cementing a victory that was shrouded in doubt and disbelief. The aftermath was catastrophic. Odinga's supporters, feeling robbed and disenfranchised, poured into the streets. The protests quickly escalated into widespread ethnic violence, pitting communities against each other in a way the country hadn't seen in decades. Over 1,000 people were killed, and hundreds of thousands were displaced from their homes. Kenya, a nation known for its relative stability, was pushed to the very brink of civil war. The 2007 election became a tragic lesson in how allegations of rigging and a loss of faith in democratic institutions can ignite a nation into flames. Let's head over to West Africa's giant Nigeria for the 2007 general elections. This was a landmark moment, or at least it was supposed to be. It was the first time in the country's history that one civilian government was handing over power to another. President Olusegun Obasanjo was stepping down, and his hand-picked successor, Umaru Yar'Adua, was the ruling party's candidate. The stage was set for a historic, peaceful transition. But what Nigeria got instead was an election so flawed, so chaotic, that it made international headlines for being a masterclass in how not to conduct a vote. The problem started before a single vote was cast. Ballot papers arrived late or not at all in many parts of the country, especially in opposition strongholds. Imagine getting all dressed up for the party, showing up at the venue, and being told the music hasn't arrived yet, and might never. That's what millions of Nigerian voters faced. In many places where materials did arrive, the scenes were just chaotic. There were reports of missing voter registration lists, insufficient polling staff, and a general sense of unpreparedness that seemed almost deliberate. This administrative chaos created the perfect environment for widespread electoral fraud. Local and international observers, including those from the European Union, delivered a damning verdict. They reported everything you can imagine in a rigged election playbook: ballot box stuffing on an industrial scale, intimidation of voters by thugs and security forces, and the buying and selling of votes in broad daylight. In some areas, the official results showed voter turnouts that were impossibly high, sometimes exceeding the number of registered voters. It was a mathematical miracle, apparently. The scale of the rigging was so blatant that it was almost comical, if it weren't so tragic for Nigeria's democracy. There were stories of polling stations where results were simply written up by party officials without any voting taking place. Opposition agents were chased away from collation centers where the real magic of number crunching happened. The whole process was less about counting votes, and more about writing them. It felt like the will of the people was merely a minor inconvenience to be overcome on the way to a predetermined outcome. Ultimately, Umaru Yar'Adua was declared the winner with a landslide 70% of the vote. But it was a hollow victory. The main opposition candidates rejected the results, calling the election a charade. The EU's chief observer said the election had fallen far short of basic international and regional standards. Even the winner, Yar'Adua, later admitted in a moment of candor that the election that brought him to power was flawed. The 2007 Nigerian election stands as a stark reminder that a historic transition on paper can be completely undermined by a process that lacks credibility, fairness, and transparency. Now let's journey into the heart of the continent, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, for the 2011 election. The DRC is a country of immense size and complexity, with a history scarred by conflict. So, holding a credible election here is a monumental task under the best of circumstances. This election saw the incumbent, Joseph Kabila, running for a second term against a crowded field of opposition candidates, most notably the veteran politician Etienne Tshisekedi. The stakes were incredibly high, and the world was watching to see if the fragile democracy could hold. From the very beginning, the logistical challenges were immense, but they soon morphed into serious questions about the integrity of the process. The voter registration process was criticized for being opaque, and there were significant delays in distributing election materials across the vast, often roadless country. On election day, chaos reigned in many areas. Polling stations opened late, some didn't open at all, and there were widespread reports of missing materials. In the capital, Kinshasa, an opposition stronghold, some polling stations were even burned down, disenfranchising thousands of voters. As the counting process began, the situation became even more murky. The National Election Commission, known by its French acronym SANI, was accused by the opposition and international observers of being heavily biased in favor of the incumbent. The compilation of results was slow and lacked transparency. Observers from the Carter Center, a highly respected international monitoring group, reported serious irregularities. They noted that in some areas, the results announced by the CENI showed that Kabila had won with an impossible 100% of the vote, with voter turnouts of 99.9%. Yes, you heard that right. Not even a single contrarian uncle in the whole district. The Catholic Church, a powerful and trusted institution in the DRC, deployed tens of thousands of its own observers. Their findings starkly contradicted the official results. They concluded that the results were riddled with errors and irregularities and did not reflect the will of the people. They strongly suggested that the opposition candidate Tshisekedi was the likely winner. When an institution with that much credibility on the ground questions the result, you know there's a serious problem. It wasn't just the opposition crying foul, it was a huge part of the country's civil society. Despite the mountain of evidence and the chorus of condemnation from both domestic and international observers, the CNEI declared Joseph Kabila the winner. Etienne Tshisekedi rejected the result and declared himself the rightful president, leading to a tense political standoff and violent clashes between his supporters and security forces. The 2011 DRC election became a case study in how a lack of transparency and a compromised electoral commission can completely destroy public trust, leaving a country divided and its democratic future in serious doubt. Our next story takes us to the small, oil-rich nation of Gabon in Central Africa and the presidential election of 2016. This was a high-stakes family affair. The incumbent, Ali Bongo Ondimba, was seeking re-election. He had taken over from his father, Omar Bongo, who had ruled the country for 42 years. His main challenger was Jean Ping, a former head of the African Union Commission and a one-time political insider. The race was tight, and the entire nation was on edge, wondering if the Bongo family's half-century grip on power would finally come to an end. The election itself was tense but relatively peaceful. As the results from various provinces started coming in, Jean Ping was building a solid lead. It looked like an upset was on the cards. His campaign team even preemptively declared victory based on the early returns, a move that only heightened the tension. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. All eyes turned to the final province to report its results, Haut-Ogooué, the Bongo family's home province and traditional stronghold. This single province would decide the fate of the entire election. And then the numbers from Haut-Ogooué came in, and they were spectacular. The official results claimed a voter turnout of 99.93%. Let me repeat that, 99.93%. This means that virtually every single registered voter in the province, the healthy, the sick, the traveling, the newborn who just turned 18, everyone apparently showed up to vote. It's a level of civic participation that would make any democracy blush with envy if it weren't so completely unbelievable. It's like saying everyone in your city went to the gym on New Year's Day. We all know that's not happening. And who did this miraculously enthusiastic populace vote for? Well, according to the official tally, 95% of them cast their ballot for Ali Bongo. This single, statistically miraculous result from one province was just enough to erase Jean Ping's lead from the other 8 provinces and hand Bongo a narrow victory of just under 6,000 votes nationwide. The math was so convenient it felt scripted. The opposition and many international observers immediately cried foul. The European Union's observer mission stated that the election had a clear anomaly in the results from Haut-Ogooué. The aftermath was predictable and violent. Protests erupted in the capital, Libreville, and the Parliament building was set on fire. The government responded with a brutal crackdown, shutting down the internet and arresting hundreds of opposition supporters. Jean Ping's demands for a recount, specifically in the controversial province, were rejected by the Constitutional Court. The 2016 Gabon election became a textbook case of how a single, suspiciously perfect result can overturn the will of a nation, leaving a legacy of bitterness, division, and deep-seated mistrust in the democratic system. Let's move to 2021, and the election in Uganda. This wasn't just an election, it was a generational clash. On one side you had Yoweri Museveni, who has been in power since 1986 before many Ugandans were even born. On the other side was Bobi Wine, a young, charismatic pop star turned politician who galvanized the youth with his message of change. His people power movement represented a direct challenge to Museveni's long-standing rule. The energy behind Bobi Wine was immense, especially online, where young Ugandans use social media to organize and express their political views. The government, however, seemed determined to silence this new wave of opposition. The campaign period was marked by an intense and violent crackdown on Bobi Wine and his supporters. Rallies were broken up with tear gas and live ammunition. Bobi Wine himself was arrested multiple times and many of his campaign staff were detained. The state used COVID-19 restrictions as a pretext to clamp down on opposition gatherings while allowing pro-government rallies to proceed. It was a clear and brutal attempt to tilt the playing field before a single vote was cast. Then, on the eve of the election, the government took a step that sent a chill through the entire country and the international community. They ordered a nationwide internet shutdown. Just like that, the digital town square where so much of the political discourse was happening went dark. Social media platforms and messaging apps had already been blocked, but this was a total blackout. The government's justification was to stop the spread of misinformation, but everyone knew the real reason: to prevent the opposition from monitoring the vote, reporting irregularities, and mobilizing their supporters. It was a digital coup. With the internet down and an army of security forces on the streets, the election took place in an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. Voters went to the polls under a veil of silence, unable to communicate freely or access independent information. Unsurprisingly, when the Electoral Commission announced the results a few days later, they declared Yoweri Museveni the winner with a comfortable majority. Bobi Wine, who was effectively under house arrest, rejected the results, calling the election a complete sham. International observers from the US and EU were largely absent, having withdrawn their missions due to the government's refusal to accredit them. The few observers who were on the ground reported numerous issues, including ballot stuffing and a heavy military presence at polling stations that intimidated voters. The 2021 Ugandan election was a stark example of modern-day authoritarianism, where the battle for democracy is fought not just at the ballot box but also online. And when you can't win the argument, you just unplug the entire country. Our journey now takes us to Cameroon for the 2018 presidential election. Here, we have one of the world's longest-serving leaders, President Paul Biya, who had been in power for 36 years at the time and was seeking his 7th term. At 85 years old, he was running for another 7 years in office. The country was facing multiple crises, including a violent secessionist movement in its English-speaking regions. In this context of deep division and conflict, the nation went to the polls, or at least some of it did. The election was marred from the start by a profound lack of transparency and a general sense of inevitability. The opposition was fractured, facing off against the monolithic power of the state and the ruling party. The electoral body, Elecam, was widely seen as being completely under the thumb of the president, with little to no independence. This perception alone was enough to make many Cameroonians cynical about the process before it even began. How can you trust the referee when he's wearing the home team's jersey? The most glaring issue was the situation in the Anglophone regions of the Northwest and Southwest. Due to the ongoing conflict, vast swaths of these regions were effectively no-go zones. Separatist fighters had called for a boycott of the election, and they enforced it through violence and intimidation. The result was that polling stations in these areas were deserted. Turnout was reported to be as low as 5% in some areas. Millions of people were disenfranchised, not by choice but by conflict and fear. An election that excludes a huge portion of the population can hardly be called national or representative. When the results were finally announced 2 weeks after the vote, there were no surprises. Paul Biya was declared the winner with over 71% of the vote. The opposition immediately cried foul. Maurice Kamto, the main opposition challenger, claimed he had won and presented his own set of results, alleging massive fraud. He pointed to irregularities across the country, including ballot stuffing and intimidation of his party's polling agents. The government's response was to dismiss these claims and later arrest Kamto and hundreds of his supporters, charging them with insurrection. The Constitutional Council, which is responsible for validating the election results and is packed with Biya loyalists, swiftly dismissed all legal challenges from the opposition. They rubber-stamped the official results without any serious investigation into the credible allegations of fraud. The 2018 Cameroonian election wasn't just rigged in the traditional sense, it was an election that felt invisible for many, erased by conflict in some regions and rendered meaningless by a lack of transparency and political opposition in others. It was a coronation disguised as a democratic process. Prepare yourself for a story from Equatorial Guinea, a small nation on the west coast of Africa that punches way above its weight in two categories: oil wealth and unbelievable election results. The year is 2016, and President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo is running for re-election. Now, running is a generous term. President Obiang is Africa's longest-serving leader, having seized power in a coup in 1979. His rule has been absolute, and elections in Equatorial Guinea are less a democratic contest and more a state-mandated ritual of affirmation. The political landscape in Equatorial Guinea is, to put it mildly, not a level playing field. It's more like a vertical cliff face that the opposition is expected to climb without ropes. The ruling Democratic Party of Equatorial Guinea, or PDG, controls every lever of state power. The media is state-run, dissent is not tolerated, and opposition parties are weak, fragmented, and operate under constant threat of harassment and arrest. The campaign period, if you can call it that, was a one-sided affair, with the president's image plastered everywhere and opposition voices barely audible. So, when the election took place, nobody was expecting a nail-biter. But even by the standards of authoritarian states, the official result was breathtaking. The Electoral Commission announced that President Obiang had won with 93.7% of the vote. Let that sink in, not 70%, not 80%, but nearly 94%. This wasn't just a landslide, it was a political avalanche, a tsunami of support that strains credulity. In a real democracy, getting 93.7% of people to agree on anything, even that the sky is blue, is practically impossible. The few opposition candidates who participated denounced the election as a complete farce. They reported numerous irregularities, including the expulsion of their polling agents from voting stations, open-air voting where privacy was non-existent, and outright intimidation of voters. One opposition party even withdrew its candidate mid-election, citing the cruel and merciless nature of the regime and the impossibility of a fair contest. The government's response to these accusations was simply to ignore them and celebrate their overwhelming, mathematically questionable victory. The 2016 election in Equatorial Guinea is a prime example of what is often called performative democracy. It's the act of going through the motions of an election, having ballots, polling stations, and a result, without any of the substance, like competition, fairness, or genuine choice. The goal is not to find out what the people want, but to project an image of popular support and legitimacy to the outside world, even if that image is built on a foundation of near-total control and fantastical numbers. It's an election where the result is a foregone conclusion, and the only suspense is seeing just how high the winning percentage will be. Our penultimate stop is Sudan in 2010. This was a hugely significant election, the first multi-party vote in the country in 24 years. It was a key part of the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement that ended the long and brutal civil war between the North and the South. The hope was that this election would pave the way for a democratic transformation and help resolve the country's many deep-seated conflicts, including the ongoing crisis in Darfur. The man at the center of it all was President Omar al-Bashir, who at the time was wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. However, the optimism surrounding this historic vote quickly evaporated. The lead-up to the election was plagued by serious problems. The opposition accused the ruling National Congress Party of using state resources for its campaign, dominating media coverage, and manipulating the voter registration process. There were deep concerns about the security situation in Darfur and other parts of the country, making a free and fair campaign impossible in many regions. The electoral framework itself seemed designed to favor the incumbent. The situation became so untenable that just days before the polls were set to open, the main opposition parties decided they had had enough. The Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the former Southern rebels, and the main partner in the Government of National Unity, announced a boycott of the presidential election and most polls in the north. Other major opposition parties followed suit. They argued that the conditions for a credible election simply did not exist and that participating would only legitimize a flawed and predetermined process. This mass boycott left President Omar al-Bashir running against a field of virtually unknown minor candidates. The competition effectively vanished. It turned what was supposed to be a landmark multi-party contest into a one-horse race. On election day, the process was chaotic. Observers from the Carter Center and the European Union noted significant technical and logistical failures, procedural irregularities, and a climate of intimidation in some areas. The boycott led to extremely low turnout in many parts of the country, especially in opposition strongholds. In the end, Omar al-Bashir was, of course, declared the winner with a commanding 68% of the vote. But it was a victory without legitimacy. He had won an election that most of his serious opponents refused to even participate in. The international community gave a muted response, acknowledging the vote as a part of the peace process but heavily criticizing its many failures. The 2010 Sudan election was a classic case of a vote that was rigged not just by stuffing ballots, but by creating an environment so unfair that the opposition had no choice but to walk away, leaving the incumbent to claim a hollow victory. For our final example, we go to the West African nation of Togo in 2005. This story begins with the death of President Gnassingbé Eyadema, who had ruled the country with an iron fist for 38 years. His death created a power vacuum, and according to the Constitution, the Speaker of Parliament should have taken over pending new elections. But that's not what happened. Instead, in a move condemned internationally as a coup d'état, the military immediately installed the late president's son, Faure Gnassingbé, as the new president. This blatant dynastic succession sparked massive protests within Togo and intense pressure from the African Union and the international community. Bowing to this pressure, Faure Gnassingbé agreed to step down and hold an election. He, of course, was named the candidate for the ruling party, the Rally of the Togolese People. The opposition, after years of being repressed, united behind a single candidate, Emmanuel Bob Akitani. For the first time in decades, it felt like there was a genuine chance for change. The election campaign was incredibly tense and marred by violence. Opposition supporters faced intimidation and attacks from security forces and pro-government militias. The state media was completely biased, giving wall-to-wall coverage to Gnassingbé while ignoring or demonizing the opposition. The Electoral Commission was packed with loyalists of the ruling party, and there were serious doubts about the integrity of the voter rolls. The entire process felt heavily tilted in favor of the son of the former dictator. On election day, the fraud was blatant and widespread, according to opposition and civil society reports. There were stories of ballot boxes being stolen by men in military uniforms, polling stations in opposition strongholds being closed down, and people being allowed to vote multiple times. As the counting began, the government imposed a media blackout, preventing independent radio stations from broadcasting any results. The Interior Minister then declared for Nasingbe the winner before the official count was even complete. The announcement triggered an explosion of violence. Enraged opposition supporters took to the streets, convinced the election had been stolen. The government responded with a brutal crackdown. Security forces fired on unarmed protesters, and pro-government militias hunted down opposition activists. In the ensuing chaos, it's estimated that between 400 and 500 people were killed, and tens of thousands fled the country as refugees. The 2005 Togolese election wasn't just rigged, it was a violent seizure of power that was laundered through a fraudulent electoral process, cementing a political dynasty and costing hundreds of lives. So there you have it. 10 stories, 10 countries, but one common, tragic theme: the subversion of democracy. From the statistical impossibilities in Gabon to the internet blackouts in Uganda and the sheer violence in Kenya and Togo, these elections were more than just flawed. They were a betrayal of the millions of people who stood in line, often for hours, believing in the promise of a choice, only to have that choice stolen from them. The impact goes far beyond a single election cycle. It erodes trust, fuels division, and can push nations to the brink of collapse. When elections are rigged, the message sent to the people is that their voices don't matter, that power is not earned through popular support but seized through force, fraud, and manipulation. This creates a cycle of cynicism and apathy, where citizens feel powerless to change their circumstances. It undermines the very institutions that are meant to be the bedrock of a stable society: the judiciary, the electoral commissions, the security forces, turning them into tools of the ruling party rather than servants of the people. Democracy becomes a performance, a hollow ritual, rather than a living, breathing process. But the story doesn't have to end here. The fight for free and fair elections in Africa is ongoing, led by brave journalists, activists, opposition leaders, and ordinary citizens who refuse to accept that this is the norm. As viewers, the most powerful thing we can do is stay informed, to understand these stories not as distant headlines but as human struggles for dignity and rights. By supporting organizations that monitor elections, by amplifying the voices of those on the ground, and by holding our own governments accountable for their foreign policy, we can contribute to the pressure for change. Because a fair vote is not a privilege, it's a fundamental human right, and it's a right worth fighting for everywhere.